Good afternoon and welcome to day 2 of the DECR's annual Summer Symposium. I'm Gursimran Oberoi. I'm the Global Watts Scholar at the University of Surrey and Watts Gallery Artists Village. I also convene the Doctoral and Early Career Research Committee and Network at the Association for Art History. This year's Summer Symposium programme centres on decoloniality. We began back in June, where on the first day of the conference, doctoral and early career research panels discussed interconnecting themes of art, decolonisation, race, gender, geography, and curation. We also welcomed Professor Susan Poisson-Locke, Director of UAL's Decolonising Art Institute, as our keynote. If you haven't already seen Susan's powerful talk titled Whose Histories, I'd strongly urge you to do so. It's available on our website, and I think Kasia will be sharing a link in the chat box very shortly. It is really one I know I'll never forget, so I hope you enjoy it. This afternoon, I'm delighted to welcome our guest speakers, Paul Goodwin, Heba Gawad, Chao Tayiana Maina, Alice Procter, and Francesco Ventrella. Before we hand over to our panel chair, Paul Goodwin, I'd just like to share a little bit more about why we selected decolonisation for this year's Summer Symposium. I think we can all agree that the past few decades have brought into sharper focus the fundamental relationship between art and Britain's past, present, and future. In 2020, the journal Art History published Decolonising Art History, giving major intervention to several of the most pressing questions being addressed in our discipline. This was followed by the publication of a resource portal dedicated to anti-racism and decolonial approaches to art history and visual culture. In 2020, the latest wave of Black Lives Matter activism swept across the UK, with a group of protesters toppling a statue of slave trader Edward Colston in Bristol. Elsewhere, the Museum of London Docklands and Guy's and St Thomas's NHS Trust removed their statues of slave traders from outdoor public display. As we know, the National Trust also produced a report addressing the histories of colonialism and historic slavery across 93 trust buildings, which sparked conversation in the government and the media about the direction of curating British heritage. The DECR committee convened this year's symposium to reflect on past momentous activities and events, and to consider the future of British art history. We wanted to ask 3 key questions. How has culture shaped and been shaped by Britain's colonial history within the UK and beyond? What is it about art specifically, with its experimental visual imagination and speculative possibilities, that might contribute to the work of decolonising Britain? And what can the UK's arts and higher education sector do to challenge entrenched structures? Debates about decolonising British art history are undoubtedly complex and multi-layered. Entrenched histories of colonialism, anti-colonialism, slavery, oppression, racism, disenfranchisement of peoples, and dispossession of objects bind the nation and continue to have bearing in our societies and other countries. There is growing momentum in the discipline towards inclusivity, and I'd like to think greater representation in our curriculum, research, and institutional setups. While being mindful of pedagogies, this symposium engages with globality and British history in its past and future, primarily from within. We hope this roundtable discussion, like the presentations before it on day 1, will highlight Britain's long-standing multicultural society and the results of the nation's mobility as a global powerhouse in influencing and being influenced by different cultural practices in the past. I want to remind you all of a quote by scholar and translator A.K. Ramanujan, who says, open quote, "No culture is immune to other cultures. No idea, invention, or technological device, whether in art, society, or science, is made by a single person or produced by a single sealed-off culture, though we often choose to think so. Each is a result of long and continuous interplays, cross-cultural exchanges, and transformations," end quote. This fluidity enables us as a nation to critically engage with the past, and as academics, it invites us to refocus attention on Britain's globality, its diverse histories and decolonial potentialities. While we hope today's conversation will cover a broad range of subjects, geographies, and temporalities, we recognise that it is just one small part of a much wider conversation. We have thus cultivated this programme with the intention of creating a safe platform to think about decolonising art history through honest and critical conversations. We encourage everyone here today to not shy away from acknowledging past injustices or racism and to use appropriate terminology accordingly. Now, before I hand over to Katia Rodriguez to run through housekeeping, I'd just like to personally thank all our speakers today. I'd also like to acknowledge my co-organiser, Susanna Kingswall, who couldn't join us today, and of course, Katia from the DECR committee, who's going to be managing the chat box and other things. A big thanks go to Sam Bibby and Kara Kazanoff at the Association for Art History for helping to bring this session together. And finally, I'd like to express our gratitude to the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art for their generous support. I'll hand over to Katia now to run through housekeeping.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. So I'll just give you some housekeeping guidelines, which I will also put on the chat box at the end. So the roundtable will begin with introductions and wrap up at around 2:30. We will then have a comfort break before reconvening at 2:40 for Q&A, and then this session will end at approximately 3 p.m. Attendees are encouraged to post questions using the Q&A function at any time. They will then be picked up by the chair in the Q&A session. You're also encouraged to communicate with each other via the chat box. The program will be made available in the chat box, so do have a look. Subtitles are also available by clicking on captions. I'd like to remind everyone that there are limitations, particularly around names and terminology, so we'd encourage all to try to speak slowly and as clearly as possible. Recordings from today's session will be made available afterwards. We expect all participants to be polite, respectful, and collegiate throughout the event and pose questions and comments in a constructive tone and manner. We would also like to remind you not to assume people's pronouns. You are welcome to leave the event at any point and will be able to rejoin by using the same link. In the event of Zoom bombing, whereby people gate crash the event with unwanted contributions, these people will be removed by the host as swiftly as possible. And please feel free to follow up any questions and engage with us on social media using the hashtags Summer Symposium and tag at DECR Art History and @4ArtHistory. And as I mentioned, this information will all be available in the chat. I'll now introduce Paul Goodwin, who will be the chair of our roundtable. Paul is a curator, researcher, and educator based in London. His multidisciplinary research and curatorial practice revolves around exploring the creative potential of both cities and exhibitions as sites of aesthetic, social, cultural, and political intervention. He is the co-lead investigator with Professor Ming Tiampo from the Carleton University in Canada of the Transatlantic Platform Funded International Research Project, WorldLink Public Cultures, the Arts and Social Innovation. He is also the co-founder of the Transnational and Transcultural Arts and Culture Exchange Network. Goodwin's current and future curatorial projects include W.E.B. Du Bois Charting Black Lives, We Will Walk, Art and Resistance from the American South, and Untitled, Art on the Conditions of Our Time, Chapter 2. Goodwin is a professor and director of Transnational Art, Identity and Nation Research Center at the University of Arts London, where he also teaches on the MA Fine Art program at the Chelsea College of Arts. I will now hand over to you, Paul.
Thank you so much, Katia. Can everyone hear me? I hope you can. I'd like to thank Gautamrin and Susanna and Katia for the kind invitation to chair today's discussion, which I'm really looking forward to, with a really fantastic group of scholars and practitioners that I think will hopefully get to the heart of some of the issues around decolonisation that we're going to be discussing today. just briefly, in terms of what we'll do today, the aim of the discussion really today, or the brief that we have, is to kind of see if we can create some kind of action list or concrete points, in a way, for emerging scholars and artists, many of whom are obviously signed on today, by sharing advice about how you can incorporate decolonial approaches in your personal and professional lives through research, writing, teaching, curatorial work, art practice, etc. And we're going to do this by, firstly, each of us will start off by speaking for about 5 minutes each about an artwork or an image that has informed some of our ways of thinking about decolonizing arts histories, or that has helped shape our various practices. And we'll come on to that in a second. Following that, we'll have a brief roundtable discussion between us for about 30 minutes, where we'll open up some of the wider questions that this entails, and some of the implications around terminology, around context, etc., that hopefully will be able to really inform our debate. And then we'll obviously go into some more practical points about what kinds of, in a way, what kind of advice comes out of that from our various practices. Then we'll, as Katia said, we'll have a short comfort break at about 2:30 for about 10 minutes. And then we'll open it up for questions from the audience, which you can submit in the Q&A function, Q&A chat function. And I'll be monitoring this, as well as Katia and Gersimren. And then you'll be able to read, and I'll read out the questions for the panelists to respond. So without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful panel that we have now. First, Heba Abd al-Gawad is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Archaeology at University College London. She's the project researcher for the AHRC-funded project Egypt's Dispersed Heritage, Views from Egypt, at the Institute of Archaeology at UCL, which is aimed at amplifying the voice, visibility, and validity of modern Egyptian communities in UK museums. And she's previously led various curatorial roles in the UK, including co-curating Two Temple Place's 2016 exhibition Beyond Beauty, Transforming the Body in Ancient Egypt, and was the project curator for the British Museum's ASUT project, and more recently has guest curated Listen to Her, Turning Up the Volume in Egypt's Ordinary Women exhibition at the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology. She specializes in the history of Egyptian archaeology, focusing on past and present Egyptian perceptions and representations of the collection and distribution of archaeological finds from Egypt to the world. Chao Tayiana Maina is a digital heritage specialist at the African Digital Heritage Museum and the Museum of British Colonialism. So she's Kenyan, she's a Kenyan digital heritage specialist and digital humanities scholar working at the intersection of culture and technology. Chao's work primarily focuses on the application of technology in the preservation, engagement, and dissemination of African heritage. She's the founder of African Digital Heritage, a co-founder of the Museum of British Colonialism, and a co-founder of the Open Restitution Africa project. And we'll be talking about restitution as well today. She holds an MSc in International Heritage Visualization with a distinction, and a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics and Computer Science. Her research work explored the possibilities of embedding intangible histories in 3D digital environments. And she's the recipient of the Google Anita Borg Scholarship for Women in Technology. And her work has been featured across many media platforms, BBC News, Reuters, BBC Arts, and many others. Alice Procter is an art historian, writer, and educator. In 2017, Alice started the Uncomfortable Art Tours, unauthorized guided tours of British museums, which I know are very popular, and exploring how major institutions came into being against a backdrop of imperialism. She's the author of The Whole Picture, the colonial story of the art in our museums and why we need to talk about it, from Kassel in 2020. And Alice's work concentrates on the intersections of post-colonial art practice, the curation of historical trauma, and narratives of national identity. And last but not least, we have Francesco Ventrella, who is a senior lecturer in art history at the University of Sussex. Francesco's research interrogates art writing and historiography from a feminist, queer, and decolonial perspective. Francesco has also written on modern and contemporary art and visual culture, feelings, and the body. He's the co-editor with Megan Clark of a special issue of Visual Resources on the topic of women and culture, women and the culture of connoisseurship, 2017, and with Giovanni Zapperi, he has recently published the volume Feminism and Art in Post-War Italy, the Legacy of Carla Lonzi on Bloomsbury. So as you can see, we've got a really great panel that covering a wide range of practices, which we will attend to very shortly. So if we move on now to the presentations, I actually didn't realize that I was actually also presenting today, but I will quickly, if we go to the slides, first slides, want to tell you very briefly about a particular artwork that I think has been very influential for me in thinking about this question of decolonization. So this is a slide from an artwork by the African-American artist, or the American artist, David Hammons. David Hammons is an artist who has, over many years, created an incredibly diverse and versatile body of work that explores African-American life in the role of race within American society. He was a very important part of the Black arts movement in the States, particularly in Los Angeles in the 1960s, and worked with the found object assemblages, with the kind of humble materials of arte povera, and with conceptual art forms, and applying that to questions of race. And he started his early works were using body prints, which use grease paper, and he moved towards multimedia installation practices, sculpture assemblages, video, painting and performance, using incredible materials such as elephant dung, chicken parts, strands of hair, and bottles of cheap wine, used to confront issues of race and hypocrisy in American life. And much of Hammons' work has been about a social critique of art world structures and the role of the art market. And he's also very well known for fiercely protecting and cultivating his status as a cultural outsider and trickster, if you like, often using sarcasm and deadpan humor in his works and performances. And I think his practice as a whole is really informative for thinking about decolonizing art institutions. This work in particular is called Sheep Raffle. And it was basically, it's not one of his most well-known works, but for me, it really speaks to this question very powerfully. So in 2004, Hammons was invited to participate in the Dakar Biennial in Dakar, Senegal, as a guest diaspora artist. Now, the Dakar Biennial is one of the first biennials on the continent, which features mostly African artists, but they also invite international artists, particularly from the African diaspora. This exhibition is a very prestigious exhibition within Senegal, which is a really important nation in relation to thinking about art, African diaspora practice. And when they invited David Hammons, who's a very well-known artist, they really were expecting him to produce a work or present a work in one of the official biennial spaces, the museums. So it's if you've ever been to Dakar, there are a number of colonial museums, really, that the French set up, which are quite prestigious and are used for exhibitions. And they were really expecting him to be part of that, to show a work in that. Hammons actually instead proposed to do a sheep raffle in a local market space, away from the museums and the galleries, and basically organized this local sheep raffle using a ticket-based lottery system. And it was organized daily for the opening week of the biennial, and he enlisted the help of local art students, DJs doing music as well as part of it, performance, and designers, and an international food company called Maggi, which was part of the Swiss Nestle group, who made soup recipes that were very popular in Senegal. So he was really trying to connect with local people. And the raffle took place, as you can see in this image, from at a busy city intersection where sheep are traditionally bought and sold for the Islamic holiday of Eid. And, you know, crowds came on, they were cheered on. The two lucky winners who each day were presented with a live sheep and music with singing and dancing. And Hammons himself was not visible in the performance. He was there, but very much in the background, documenting and photographing the events as they happened. And it's probably true to say that most, if many, if not most of the people who took part in the sheep raffle were not even aware that this was in fact an artwork. They just thought it was a sheep raffle. So why is this rather innocuous and not very well known artwork, in my opinion, a really important work for thinking through decolonisation? Well, I think firstly, it extended the field of aesthetic practice into the social field, everyday life, in a mischievous but non-condescending way. Hammons wanted to reach his work to reach ordinary local people who don't go to white cube galleries and museums in Dakar, many of which, as I've said, were really, these museums were very much legacies of French colonial administration. So he completely bypassed the colonial network of art institutions, which he often does in his practice, which I think is really important. The artist said about his work, quote, "People in Dakar do not go to exhibitions. They think that the Dakar is for white people. At least with the sheep raffle, I'll give them something they can relate to." So I think for me, this work really stands out in reminding us that there are ways that we can curate, we can make work, which is not necessarily within and complicit with the art world institutions that we work in, that we can move outside of that space into that broader context. The last point very quickly I'll make about it is that I think this work also doesn't fall into the trap of what some socially engaged projects fall into, a kind of one-dimensional, simplistic interpretation of, quote, social justice or community art. Instead, this work, Sheep Raffle, I think eludes single descriptions or interpretations. It opens up multiple, often contradictory questions, such as, was it a social practice? Was it a street performance? Was it a critique of Western art history? So it had many different ways of interpreting this performance. And I think, again, that multidimensional element is really important for thinking about how we decolonize art institutions. So that's my particular take on this. I would like to now ask Heba to please give her take, and then Alice, followed by Alice, and then Chao and Francesco. So Heba, can I pass over to you? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, and it's such a great honor to be here with such wonderful and many of the activists that I do personally admire and appreciate their work so much. And I'll just wait for the slide to change, unless it has changed and my internet is a bit slow. I'm talking from Cairo, so internet connections can be a bit tricky, giving us also something to think about how digital connectivity doesn't make things accessible to everyone. Having things digitally online doesn't mean that they are equally accessible to everyone around the world, something that we can experience here in Cairo every day. The object that I'll be talking about, and I think, I guess it's expected, but perhaps I would talk about it for different reasons, which is the Rosetta Stone, one of the most world famous objects in the world, the most world famous stone in the world. But today I don't want to talk about the Rosetta Stone, the world's Rosetta Stone, but my Rosetta. And my Rosetta is the city of Rashid, which is where the name came from. Rosetta is the find spot, or is the European name given to the city of Rashid, where the stone was found. In the constructed story of the stone that we see in the British Museum, or perhaps in European Western Egyptology or archaeology, The stone, this gave us a key to the cracking the code of the hieroglyphs. But for me, the stone encapsulates, and if we move to the other slide, it does encapsulate all the problems that we have for not only the description or the way that the Rosetta Stone is described in the British Museum, but equally with decolonization. Every few weeks, the Rosetta Stone makes the headlines stating that Egypt demands the return of the Rosetta, but which Egypt? And to return it to who? And why return the Rosetta Stone? And how? Where would the Rosetta Stone reside once it's back to Egypt? And why is the Rosetta Stone even important? Why would the Egyptians want the Rosetta Stone specifically back? Moving to the next slide, we would see that the Rosetta Stone that exists in the British Museum, or the version of Rosetta, which is just the find spot that exists in the British Museum, is a colonial British construct. This is not my Rosetta. This is not Rashid, which I know as the most famous Egyptian city in the anti-colonial movement. The city of Rashid, it had witnessed large anti-colonial activism against both the French and British colonialism. Rashid is not just a find spot. It's where many Egyptian lives were lost. It's where the activism of Egyptians against the colonial forces has been witnessed. And it's where multiplicity of voices existed in the past and in the present. And it's where also the Egypt that we see, not the Egypt that you see in the museum, or the Egypts that live in and within us exist. The British Rosetta Stone, or the stone that you see in the museums, is just a simple colonial construct, and this is very clear in the carving that even the army felt that it would be appropriate to carve on the stone that this was captured by the British Army and to hand it to King George III. This is a colonial trophy. What you see there is a colonial trophy. Moving to the next slide. Why would we as Egyptians want the Rosetta Stone back, or where would we want it back? There are multiplicity of voices within Egypt, and there are multiplicities of reasons of why we should have it back or why we should not have it back. Me being an Egyptian archaeologist talking today about the Rosetta Stone, I'm expected to state that let's return everything back, let's return the Rosetta Stone to Egypt. But actually, I'm totally against repatriation as it stands today with the current policies that exist with repatriation today. Repatriation or restitution, if it's intended to bring social justice, then this justice would never happen if the Rosetta Stone returns with the current narrative surrounding the Rosetta. Rosetta as a city, as I said, is a city of multiplicity of Egyptian heritage, multiplicity of Egyptian voices. It did witness a multiplicity of all the layers of Egyptian history, from its ancient times to its most modern times. On the other hand, the Rosetta, but this time as the stone, is an example of the whitewashing of all the Egyptian and Arab scholars' effort to decipher the hieroglyphs. We always hear of Champollion as the great hero of the making of hieroglyphs accessible to the world and bringing ancient Egypt to the world. We never hear of Ibn Wahshiyya, the Arab scholar who in 1802, 40 years just before the decipherment of the hieroglyphs by Champollion, who has published a book which got translated into English. So there is no reason that the British Museum, nor does Champollion, not know about Ibn Wahshiyya, the Arab scholar who did the first attempt in deciphering or in attempting to crack the code of the Egyptian hieroglyphs. The whole world knows about Champollion, but very few know about Ibn Wahshiyya and his efforts. Moving to the next slide, something or a mini project that I've been leading is looking into social media, or the Egyptian use of social media, and how the Egyptians tend to respond to the many posts that the British Museum would make about the Rosetta Stone. And this is something that I've been collecting since 2015, and it's currently part of two projects that I'm very honored to be part of, the Egypt's Dispersed Heritage Project and the 100 Histories in One Object project, which I would put the link for in the chat for everyone to check. There is a multiplicity of voices in Egypt. If the government, for example, which is calling for the return of the Rosetta Stone, wants the stone to reside in the new Grand Egyptian Museum, the people, as in the residents of Rashid, where the stone was discovered, want the stone to be displayed in Rashid. Other wants it in San al-Hagar, or where the object really was. Moving on to the final and last slide is, I would just bring up the question into 5 main questions, which I find why the decolonizing turn that we are witnessing today in the UK is quite problematic. We tend to talk about objects without any perception of the people. We tend to talk about returning it to people without any identification of which or what people. How do we want to return object back? For who are we returning them back, and from whom? This is not only the property of the British Museum, that is the Rosetta Stone, but it's the property of European and Western perceptions of ancient Egypt. And the question that has to be at the forefront is, why are we doing all this? If this is for the sake of museums and not for the people, then we are doing something wrong. This is not how decolonization should operate. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Heba. Alice, can we have your presentation, please?
I should be visible, I think. Hello, I have one image to show you, and I wanted to just talk quickly about the way that it relates to my work, particularly around the idea of decolonization in museums as being about the conversation between past and present. So if you could click onto my picture, please. Great. This is a painting called Sir No Beard by Daniel Boyd. The painting's from 2007, and Boyd is an Indigenous Australian artist. He's of Kujula and Gangalu descent, and his work often relates to the representation of Indigenous and settler Australian histories in conflict. I find this work really compelling, and it was one of the Boyd was one of the first artists I became interested in as a teenager when I was looking at studying art history, and particularly relating it to my own history as a white settler Australian person. So some of you might recognize that this painting is a reference to the Reynolds portrait of Sir Joseph Banks. Banks in the original is shown with the sort of trophies of his collecting voyages, shall we say. He's wearing a Maori cloak. He has spears and paddles that we know were actually part of his collection and that he displayed in his home surrounding him. And the original painting was made after he returned from participating in Captain Cook's Endeavour voyage to the South Pacific. So what Boyd has done in this picture is turn Banks into a pirate. Sir No Beard is a play on the idea of Blackbeard as a pirate, and also a reference to the fact that in many of the accounts of Indigenous Australian people meeting white Europeans for the first time, there's a discussion over the fact that the Europeans are understood as having an ambiguous gender because the men don't have facial hair. And so this idea of playing on the no beard as a way of referring to him kind of as a pirate, but also as this person who is incomprehensible to the societies that he's meeting. The thing that I find most compelling about this painting is you might be able to see down the bottom next to Banks's feet, there is a head in a jar. This is a self-portrait of Boyd, and it's a reference to the fact that Banks and his contemporaries were also involved in the collecting of human remains for display. Banks was involved in the transmission and acquisition of several ancestral remains during his travels in the Pacific and his kind of political power and his relationship with the British Museum in particular. We know that during his time on the Endeavour voyage, he acquired what was most likely the first moko mokai, so a preserved tattooed head made by Maori people as part of a funerary practice, which he then brought back to Britain and displayed with his collection alongside the objects that are shown in this picture. We don't see that side of Banks's collecting in this image. Banks was also involved in the acquisition, most likely by Hunter of the Hunterian Museum, of the head of a man called Pemaloi. Pemulwuy was a Yora man, probably Bijigal, although we don't know for certain which nation he was from, who was a significant leader of resistance against the European colonists in what is now Sydney in 1800. So in the 1800s, Pemulwuy was considered one of the major figures of rebellion, and as such, a price was put on his head. He was killed, and after his death, his head was preserved in a jar of spirits and sent to Banks, who then gave it most likely to Hunter. Pemulwuy's remains are now missing. We don't know what happened to his skull. We don't know what happened to his gravesite or anything like that. And he is a striking example of the way that Banks and Banks's peers, particularly the white Brits who were involved in the invasion of Australia, are commemorated, whereas someone like Pemulwuy is very much under-remembered. I find it very striking that Boyd uses his self-portrait in this image as a way of asserting continuity, but also of demonstrating the kind of violence that's done by people like Banks as a living legacy as well. To me, a lot of the work of decolonisation is about creating a kind of conversation between past and present. I obviously work in art galleries, so I work with historic paintings and use them to try and understand the stories that people tell about themselves. But I also work with contemporary art, and I think that artists like Boyd can be really instrumental in changing the sort of narratives that we tell about the past. So I realize this is a very rapid introduction to an artist that many of you probably haven't heard of, and I would be surprised if many people here know anything about Pemulwuy. But I want to encourage you to think about this story of Boyd and Pemulwuy in relation to the histories that we're much more familiar with of artists like Reynolds and Banks, and understand the ways in which a contemporary artist can bring these erased, ignored, marginalized, deliberately excluded narratives of resistance and narratives of violence to the foreground through their work. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Alice, and some really powerful presentations from both of you that bring up questions of restitution, violence, that will obviously feed into conversation. Can I ask Chao now to present, please? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Now, today I'm going to be talking about the period of the struggle for independence here in Kenya, but I'm going to be exploring it through the life and the journey of one particular man. If you could have the next slide, please. Now, the man photographed here is known, or was known as Daren Kimati, and he was the leader of the Mau Mau uprising movement, which was a movement that was looking for the reclamation of land and freedom for Kenyans. Just to give you a background on the land situation, particularly in the 1930s and the 1940s, by 1934, around 7 million acres of land had been seized by the British colonial government and was exclusively being used in various forms for white settler activities. By the 1930s in particular, for the Kikuyu community, the situation was so acute that by 1948, 1 million Kikuyu had ownership of 2,000 square miles, while 30,000 British settlers owned 12,000 square miles. Now, the push and the movement for freedom did begin much earlier than the 1950s. However, the Mau Mau uprising was a culmination of the kind of guerrilla warfare and the violent struggle and resistance against British occupation. As I mentioned, the man that we see here, Daren Kimati, was known as the de facto leader of the Mau Mau. So the two photographs that we see here are very interesting for me because one of them is a photograph that was taken when he was captured by the British government in 1956 after leading a freedom army in the forest, an army of forest fighters for 3 to 4 years. The photo that you see on the right of him standing upright was actually taken in 1953. And this was taken by himself. He facilitated the taking of this photograph, and he dropped it outside a British military camp saying, I heard that you have no photos of me. So here's a photo of me. Because at that point, the colonial government was really not sure about who is this man who is leading this movement. And so we have him delivering this photograph of himself directly to the British camp and saying, I think you seem to need a visual of who I am and how I look, and this is it. And the photo that we see on the left is a photo taken in 1956. That was him on the day that he was captured. He had been shot and wounded. And the reason why I picked these two photographs was just to speak to the nature of the ways in which he was remembered. So the photo on the left, in which he's lying down, is probably the most famous photograph of Kimathi. This is what ended up in newspapers. It ended up in primary school books. It ended up in literature. It ended up, I mean, it is practically the most ubiquitous photo of him that we have. And I was very interested in the ways in which this kind of visual representation of him was used by the British as this triumph over the Mau Mau, or triumph over the independence movement, and became so embedded in our consciousness by virtue of being really printed over and over again, shown in documentaries and the likes. And then we have this other photograph that he sent in of himself, and how he saw himself not really coming into the forefront until pretty much social media, and that's when we began to see it. So as a child growing up through the entire school system, I only saw this one photo of him lying down, and I encountered this other photograph on social media. And so in my work on decolonization, I often think about representation, I think about digitization, and I think about the ways in which we are able to access these archives and access this material. I think also very much in the ways in which these archives are being reimagined, are being illustrated, are being digitally visualized. And for me, it's very surprising and at the same time encouraging to see this other photograph of Kimathi becoming more and more prominent in discussions, becoming, you'll see it on social media, you'll see it on t-shirts. And it's very interesting to kind of break that singular narrative that was promoted by the British government through this one photograph. So I do look at ways in which archives, particularly archives or colonial archives, are being digitized, but also how and who has access to them. And Heba also talked about who, how, and why. And when we speak about objects, when we speak about photographs, I do believe that these are questions that we need to be asking. I'll finally end with a quote, and I'm happy to speak about this photograph more in the Q&A. But on the morning of his execution, Kimathi was executed by hanging on the morning of, I think, February 1957. And he asked his wife to come and see him, and this is what he said: "I have no doubt in my mind that the British are determined to execute me. I have committed no crime. My only crime is that I am a Kenyan revolutionary who led a liberation army. Now, if I must leave you and my family, I have nothing to regret about it. My blood will water the tree of independence." And so as I read this quote, the visual or I have of Kimathi speaking really is a photo on the right. And I do wonder, if I had never seen this photo and if I had never come across this photo, how would I interpret this quote, and how would I interpret his life, having only this one visual reference that was taken by the British colonial government? Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you, Chao and Francesco. You've got quite a lot there to live up to, Francesco, because the panelists so far have been fantastic. I'm sure that you're more than capable of dealing with that. So thank you, Francesco.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Paul, Heba, Chao, and Ellis for having brought up a number of issues that we will, disentangle also later in the Q&A. So the image that I brought today is not really a work that I want to explain, but perhaps is the carrot piece by Lubaina Hamid is a model, a sort of pedagogical model that I try to apply. And I want to start by reflecting on the spaces that I occupy as a teacher and an academic, so the university, but also by extension, the museum. Because when I think about decolonization, I think about, in Britain in particular, think about decolonization in times of culture wars, and the term culture wars in itself is contentious here. And I just wanted to run through a number of facts to set the scene for the reason why this artwork is a pedagogical tool. In September 2020, the Department for Education told teachers in England, that to use material created by organizations that take extreme political stances on matters such as to abolish or overthrow capitalism, and the association here was Black Lives Matter and the environmental movement, so that these materials should not be taught in the classroom. In 2020, again, the government instructed museums and galleries about its position on contested heritage. This is obviously following the Colston statue episode. And the position of the government is that these institutions should not support the removal of statues or other similar objects. This year, the report from the government's Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities has called for, and here I'm quoting, all children to reclaim their British heritage against negative calls for decolonizing the curriculum, end of quote. And as many people working in academia in the UK know, the Secretary of State for Education announced a few months ago the appointment of a free speech champion for universities, which will guarantee, and I'm quoting from the government website, tougher legal measures to strengthen free speech and academic freedom at universities in England, and to stamp out unlawful silencing on campuses. Now, obviously, the question here is who is being silenced? So this all happens in a time in which words like decolonization and diversification are often used interchangeably in job advertisement, to work in the university, to advertise degrees, but also in the museum sector. In those same institutions, however, decolonization and diversification have become the two things that need to be managed. So, and I'll give you an example that perhaps is relatable. If you challenge your head of school or the CEO of an association because their policies, for instance, reproduce white supremacy or structural racism, you are likely to be accused of bullying. And from an institutional point of view, as I said, diversification is the thing that needs to be managed, and therefore in order to maintain a certain distribution of power, not to change that distribution of power. So while decolonization is being added to the agenda of British universities and museums, words like inclusivity and diversification increasingly seem to stand in as screens that hide, let's say, the reality of white supremacy and structural racism within these institutions. The problem is famously summarized by Sarah Ahmed a few years ago when she writes that the creation of diversity as a political solution can participate in making those who speaks about racism the cause of the problem. So the carapace is an artwork that I used to in a seminar with my first year students, precisely to redress perhaps certain imbalances around the way in which the word decolonization is used in the classroom, but also who uses it, and understanding how sometimes the term is being co-opted. The work is humorous, and Lubaina Himid has spoken about this work. The white man on a motorcycle hangs this carrot to a woman who turns back, and she's really not sure what is being offered to her. And that is because her basket is full. She already has everything that she needs. So why on earth could she be tempted by the carrot? And in 1985, Himid, with this work, wanted to address their position as a Black and a woman artist in the art world in Britain. And Himid says that when the work was made, cultural institutions needed to be seen to be integrating Black people into their programs. And I'm quoting from Himid here, we as Black women understood how we were being patronized, to be cajoled and distracted by silly games and pointless offers. We understood, but we knew what sustained us and what we really needed to make a positive cultural contribution, self-belief, inherited wisdom, education, and love. So decolonization is a term that is being co-opted by institutions like university and museums as a new commodity. And this is something that I would like to discuss in the Q&A perhaps a bit more. And this is this artwork, for instance, when I taught it in the classroom, I use it also to address, as I said, certain imbalances within the classroom, the way in which decolonization is being repackaged by the institution and given back to students, given back to our Black and brown students. So how can we work in these institutions and interrupt the extraction of culture and knowledge from people who have historically been marginalized by these institutions where I work? And often we hear the term decolonization as a discourse that is structured around a lack, either exclusion or the institutional guilt. You know, the museum decolonizing the collection because it's guilty, of course, of certain colonial histories. This is important. I'm absolutely not belittling that, but I also want to take Himid's work as a pedagogical model instead, as a reminder that certain resources are already in the hand of our students. They are in their heritage, they are in their sense of belonging, and perhaps our job as educators is to help them find those resources by themselves, rather than repackaging them and selling them back, because, you know, in a British university, they are literally sold, considering the university is not free, but is a state of debt for the students. So when I think about action points, for instance, in the classroom, in my job, I think about the importance of mentoring and the role that mentoring plays in decolonizing the university. But also when we teach decolonization, one of the questions that I ask myself is who is benefiting from this conversation? And finally, as a rule, I think in the classroom, I give myself the rule that it is impossible to talk about decolonization only by conveying narrative of oppression. It is also crucial, vital, I would say, to present to our students narratives of resistance. And thinking about pedagogy, I really like, Chao, what you said about those two photographs and how you have encountered in history books. So I hope we can talk about that a bit later. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco. If all our speakers could now put their cameras on, so we can engage in a short discussion. We're running a little bit over time, but I want to thank everyone for those really thoughtful and rich presentations. And Francesco, I gave you the task of fulfilling, living up to the previous presentations. You more than lived up to that, and I'm especially pleased to see that you used Lebena's carrot piece, which was installed there in the picture at Tate Britain, which I had the pleasure of curating that show with Lebena at Tate Britain. So I remember very well the conversations we had around that piece. And I must admit, I didn't actually at that point have a conversation with Lebena about the pedagogical implications of that. So I really found what you said to be important. I think what we'd like to do, because we do want to have space and time for everyone to be able to give questions. So I think what we want to move to now on our panel is to move a bit quickly, I think a bit quicker than we thought we would do, to practical solutions. And Francesco, you kind of started actually really helpfully by laying out some solutions or some action points that came out of your practice about mentoring, about the question of who's benefiting, about the importance of presenting narratives of resistance. So can I perhaps ask you all to think about, from your various practices, and to take into account the various contexts. We've got like amazingly different geographical and social contexts, to think about this question of decolonization. And as I kind of provocatively said in our conversations before this, we need to kind of, I think, in my opinion, we need to decolonize decolonization, or at least let me be specific about that. I think we need to historicize decolonization, because often we think about decolonization as starting, in 2019 with Black Lives Matter, and in fact, decolonization and decolonial movements, go back into the 50s and before, in terms of anti-colonial resistance. That has always been a very important part of resistance in the global South before they came to the global North. Anyway, so just to kind of add that as a context, but let me start then with Francesco, as you raised that question of action points. Can you maybe just quickly, just maybe elaborate a little bit more and give us some advice to get some of our early career researchers and doctoral students? You mentioned a really important context, actually. I think they're really important about the culture wars. Yeah. And absolutely incredible. I mean, we are in a war. You're right. Yeah. We are in a war. Yeah. So what are the tools that we need to fight that war, Francesco?
Yeah, we are in a war, and it's important to be aware of that and be conscious. because then it also means that we need to work to make allyships when you are at war. And what really worries me is that there is no degree, no university that has not decolonized everything, in the same way in which there is no museum at the moment who would claim that they're not interested in decolonization. Obviously, they are using the word in their own terms, because the power distribution is not being challenged there. So in the classroom, for instance, for me is extremely important. Well, I'll give you an example. I teach modern and contemporary art, and I teach a modern a module on modernism, 1900, 1960. And this module is basically around Paris, but it doesn't need to be about Paris. It's more about the Mediterranean and the Algerian artist who worked in Paris in the 1920s and 30s. The artist involved Muhammad Mukhtar in the Egyptian revolution in the 1920s. We can actually teach that period of modern art by looking not at Paris, but at the Mediterranean as a sea of crossings and cultural exchanges. A lot of books have been written from the point of view of colonial France, but I'm thinking about artists like Mahmoud Mameri, Azouaou, sorry, Mameri, and the work that he does in Algeria and Morocco. And so for me, really changing modern art by shifting the pivot from the capital city of European modernism to the periphery, but also making students reflect on the power distribution of that center periphery narrative. So here is an example of something that I've been teaching for the past 5 years.
Wonderful. So in a way, shifting the geography of reason.
Yes.
where reason and rationality and all these kinds of things that the West have traditionally claimed, we need to decenter that. Thank you so much, Francesco. Can I ask Heba to respond to this question of maybe thinking more practically about points? I mean, Heba, I was really struck by your presentation where you expressed slight doubts or misgivings about this question of restitution, or at least thinking about it in a more complex way.
Of course.
Give us some your thoughts.
Yes. Yes, there are two things that I would bring here. First of all, repatriation as it stands, even when we've seen the Savoy profile, no one went and asked the people what do they want, the communities. And the current power structure in many of the African countries, in the Middle East as well, it means that the objects would be returned back to whoever owns the heritage in these countries, and this is the government. And obviously, as we know, there is a huge conflict of interest then, and there is no way that the public can get, or the local communities can get included, neither in the decision nor in a discussion. And for myself, returning an object would do, in the case of Egypt, would do nothing but adding another repression cycle to the people who are already oppressed. That's one thing. So unless the terms of repatriation have changed, unless there is more multivocality into the decision making, into the choice. And also we need to reflect on, for example, the Rosetta Stone. Why would we want the Rosetta Stone back? The Rosetta Stone is a European construct. We have in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo the full stone, from which the Rosetta is actually a copy in ancient times. It was a copy of the actual script that we have in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. I think what would work best for us is to counter the narrative, highlight that the original copy, if you want to come and see the complete Rosetta Stone, come to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo in Tahrir. This is where the Rosetta, the complete version of the decree sits. The Rosetta Stone is nothing but a branding stunt for Britain and for the British Museum. It's bringing a lot of commerce, a lot of money into Britain. It's become a British branding tool. It has no value for us in terms of the national identity. It has no even value in ancient times, because even in ancient times it was considered as a copy. So it does nothing but the whitewashing of the making of ancient Egypt, or the construction of what the frozen and extremely colonial image of ancient Egypt that we see in museums. This is one thing. The second thing is also that no one talks about, even in the curricula or in the museums, about the violence that colonialism did include. If we talk about the case of Algeria, 1 million got like totally killed by the French colonial forces, and their heads are in the museums in France. And only now that the Algerian government is talking about repatriating those heads back. The students today need to know about the violence that occurred with the act of colonialism. There were boots on the ground, lives were lost, because there is this peaceful image that even in the current decolonizing discourse, that we're only talking about the extraction of objects from their source communities and giving them to museum. No one talks about the violence, the atrocities of colonialism. And the students today, the future, they have no access to such narrative. I know the narrative because I'm Egyptian. It's part of my own history curricula. I get taught this at school every day. But none of my British postgraduate students, when I was doing my degree in the PhD in the UK, none of them knew anything about British colonialism. They knew nothing about the wars that Britain has led on our ground against France or Germany, etc., and the many of our lives lost in the process. So for me, yeah, repatriation is problematic with the current policies, and the very peaceful image of colonialism that is given to us. That is why decolonization is problematic. We don't even have a word in Arabic for decolonization. It doesn't exist. We only have anti-colonialism. There is no such term. That is, you can't undo colonialism. How can you do it?
Wow, Heba, we could, yeah. I mean, you've opened up a hornet's nest there of some really powerful questions.
I apologize. It's just I'm fed up.
There is absolutely no reason to apologize. We just talked about shifting the geography of reason, right?
Exactly.
And then shifting geography of reason also means critically understanding, critically deconstructing the way we think about decolonization, particularly in the West. And that in different contexts, it may have a very different reason. And I loved when you talked about, well, one, you connect with Alice's questions about violence. I think violence is really important.
Yes.
But the other thing is about, the language of decolonization, which, as you said, I mean, what about anti-colonialism?
Exactly. This is what should be anti-colonialism. How can you decolonialism?
I think obviously the question of restitution is a controversial one, because there's lots of people would say, well, look, yes, we have complex issues about restitution, but at the end of the day, these objects need to go back.
Yes, it's true.
You raise important questions about that context. Hey, well, let's just quickly go on to chat. Thank you so much. We'll bring up to that. I know there's a question about that in the chat, so you can respond a bit more in depth to that in a second after our break. Chao, again, you're coming from Kenya, and you talked about those powerful images and photography, the role of photography as well as objects. What kinds of practical advice, solutions, conclusions do you bring from your research, particularly in the digital?
Well, I mean, for me, it's definitely been a journey, because I am a student of the system and I'm a product of the system. So I did very much act and be part of the system, because I knew nothing else. I knew that the only official historical references are written references. I knew that, if it's written, it has to be 100% true. I knew that you can't question things in archives, and so for me, my personal journey in this work has very much been about understanding the system that I am a part of, that I have inherited just by virtue of being born in Kenya, the idea of Kenya, which is the construction of the nation that is Kenya, and then having to sort of navigate my way around a lot of the discomfort that has existed within me by virtue of how this information has come to me. And so for me, the first, I would say the first practical advice, or let's say tip, that I would give is actually to encounter both the personal and the historical, because I do think a lot about the place of empathy. I do think a lot about the place of vulnerability, about putting myself in certain situations, even when I encounter archives, and how that changes how I encounter these archives. And so for me, the personal is an important part of how I approach this work, and how I disseminate it and how I share it. And the second part, I would say, is a lot of the work that we have been exploring is around active participation in history. And by active participation, I mean an expansion of the sources that we use, an expansion of how we view archives. You know, the landscape is an archive, people are archives. There's so many multiple archives around us and within us. And you know that when we open our eyes to actually encountering them and listening to them very deliberately, we begin to see and explore narratives that are beyond what is, you know, what is in the obvious realm. So one of the things, for example, when we digitize images, and I've been working with a lot of groups here in Nairobi, specifically some libraries, to digitize a lot of photographs that are from the colonial period. And we are deliberately actually designing metadata standards to rewrite captions. You know, we're not just going to say that this caption that says this is a Maasai woman, full stop, and that's the entirety of her life, is then going to be replicated in everything else. So can we describe these photographs in new ways? Can we pick out things like discomfort and, you know, tension in these photographs and make them a part of the description and understanding of these photographs and how people come to them online? So these are some of the things that we've been doing. And in another form is also, for me, a question is, why do we separate resistance from decolonization? You know, like when we talk about resistance movements and then we talk about decolonization, when I look at people like Daren Kimati and the photograph that I showed, for me, that is a form of pushing back against colonialism and saying, you're spreading this image of me or this narrative of me, but this is what I think of myself. This is how I view myself. And if you need something, then use this, you know? And I think it's very powerful to, as you said, it's not so much about, you know, having a start point for decolonization, but looking at the long history of it and how people have resisted colonialism, how they have pushed back, how they have staked their claim and their place in the narrative against, you know, this huge Western force of identity. So those are some of the things that we're working on. Another thing that we're doing is looking at visualizations and a reimagining of places and sites. And I think sometimes we're working, yes, to encourage a broader historical awareness, but at the same time, for me, a lot of this work is about showing possibilities and saying that I am here and I'm doing this work, and that opens up the possibility for someone else to feel like they can be a part of this, that they can do this in their own way or in one way or another. And so building this kind of communities around particularly social media. And I know Heba had talked about the importance of social media and observing discourse, you know, and observing public discourse and understanding what people, what they feel, what they have never had a chance to say in a museum setting. You know, no one cares about what you think in the museum. You go there, you see, and you leave. And so when we have these places and formations of different discourse, I think it's very important to listen and to document this as part of even decolonization or anti-colonialism in itself. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And we're getting so many incredible points here. Unfortunately, we you know, we don't have the time to capture everything, but I mean, I really loved your point about the need to explode archives, open up archives to different interpretations, bring in the personal. You know, this, yeah, I mean, there's so much we can unpack there, but let's go to Alice for your thoughts, Alice, on and from your practice in terms of conversations and uncomfortable conversations.
So I would say, echoing what everyone else has been talking about, a lot of my work is focused on education, and particularly the idea of introducing the concept of a museum as a troubling space to people who may not have experienced that or considered that before. My relationship with decolonization and the idea of anti-colonialism is very white. I'm working in Britain. I'm working primarily with art collections in the cultural West. I'm working with the legacy of Australia as a settler colony. And so my focus is, it kind of inevitably, on bringing the understanding of colonial institutions as lasting and troubling to people who have not experienced that before, not considered that before. It's by me as a white girl to a white audience that have not really thought about these things or experienced them directly. And a large part of what I do is about trying to make people recognize that the legacies of imperialism are felt by everyone. They're felt in different ways. They might be felt as a benefit by some people. And so trying to make that tangible and obvious within a museum setting is really important. But I work primarily with adults who, by and large, have not thought about these things before, because they're not included in school curricula, or they're not presented in a way that's accessible or engaging for audiences unless you go looking for them. So in my perspective, a lot of the work that needs to be done is about introducing conversations about imperial violence and colonial history to school settings, working in educational spaces to try and make this more tangible. And along with what Chao's saying about questioning the archive and kind of expanding the archive and recognizing that these are places that are by nature exclusionary, trying to work with that understanding of discomfort, which is the core of my work, is about making people realize that if you feel comfortable with the history you've been told, it's probably because there's something missing. It's probably been left out or edited or selectively told. So I see the work that is happening now around decolonization, particularly in terms of trying to put it in its historical context of anti-colonialism, as really important, and particularly the way that that's being done in a kind of public and accessible way, which is a bit different to the histories of anti-colonialism and decolonization. You know, the very fact of the internet, as uneven as access to it may be, means that these conversations are happening in a more public space. And I think that's what's making this time is different, because it's online, because it's a little more international and a little more accessible. And these conversations are no longer exclusively happening in an academic space. They're happening in the media because of the whatever the hell we want to call this political assault on arts and culture. That part of that does mean that we're seeing these conversations in a much more public forum, for better or for worse.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Alice. I mean, all of you are just bringing fire to this debate. I mean, you know, you're exploding some of the kind of easy assumptions about decolonization and decolonial practice, and opening the debate into really important questions that I think we need to address. Alice, I think I like the fact that you talk about whiteness, because often, you know, decolonization is something for the black and brown people over there. Well, guess what? You know, white people are at the center of this, and we need to unpack whiteness critically. So you're really important. Okay, what I want to suggest now, I think we do need to have a break. Okay, I think we will continue our discussion. So if all the panelists can if you're ready, turn your cameras back on, and then we can move on to some questions that are coming in from the various. Yeah, we're gradually coming back in. We've got about 15 minutes left, folks, which is not a lot of time, but we do have a few questions that I think we can address. So the first question is from Theo Batmanidis, and I'll just read this. This is really brought up. This is a direct response to Heba's point, which I knew it would provoke quite a few questions, Heba. But of course, you know, the others can also jump in with responses to this. So Theo's question is actually quite a few questions. So he says, is repatriation of objects like the Rosetta Stone not important as a symbolic gesture against historic colonialism in itself? Despite Heba's apprehension regarding implied adverse, perhaps political aspects of repatriation, is the associated symbolism itself not an important intervention? Is the implication that such gestures might gloss over more important ongoing aspects of latent colonialism? Why should gestures such as repatriation be perceived as in conflict with meaningful post-colonial discourse? Would such an approach be not like throwing the baby out with the bathwater? So again, if Heba, you can respond to that directly, and then perhaps some of the other, anyone else can also come in with their comments on repatriation. Thanks.
Yeah, for me, I find it problematic because of how repatriation itself is defined, let's say, in practice and policy within the institutions that are in charge of repatriating objects, or within the laws that existed. We have to say that even the laws of repatriation were done by Western institutions, be it like for policies or for practices. And I'm not sure if throwing things back at the local communities and telling them, yes, you can now deal with it, is very meaningful. It's like, okay, we're giving everything back now, where hands are clean, that's it. It's now your problem to deal with it. And I'm talking about the case for Egypt. This is what I can speak for. And I can respond, for example, to, because there is a third question that is relevant, that asks about who would want to return the object to, the Rosetta. And maybe the story I'll tell very shortly would give everyone an idea of why I'm not very much pro-repatriation as it exists today. For example, for us, it is the state or the government that has all responsibility of looking after heritage for us here in Egypt. And there is no public discourse whatsoever. We have no say, there is no filter for us as local communities of us to raise our opinions or discuss. In 2010, there has been a case that was filed into Egyptian courts by one lawyer from Rashid, with a signature, with a petition signed from many of the residents of Rashid, which is Rosetta, where the stone came. They are asking the Egyptian government to submit an official request to the British Museum for the Rosetta stone to be returned to Egypt, but not to the new Grand Egyptian Museum that is currently being built, but to the city of Rashid itself. Interestingly, while every now and then there is a media appearance for state famous persons that they should remain unnamed, but I guess everyone would know the names. Every few months or it's more of a political stunt, because in reality, Egypt has never submitted an official request asking for the British stone back. This is something that all of us Egyptologists know. This is something that the British Museum has admitted. But every few, when there is a political dysfunctioning in Egypt, let's say, we would have the headline, Egypt wants the Rosetta Stone back. This is a political stunt to cover up for other incidents, local incidents happening here. The case that was filed by the people of Rashid was refused, and the court sentence was that the Egyptian government is not responsible for returning objects that were taken code for it. So when the people ask for the objects to be returned, the court says actually the Egyptian government is not obliged. They would mean that it would get displayed in the
Heba, unfortunately, I think we're having some connection problems. Has anyone else experienced seeing that? Yeah. And this is again some of the issues that when we expand the discourses, we have to be mindful of this. While Heba is hopefully going to come back to us, does anyone else want to kind of take up this question of repatriation? Because obviously she's introduced quite an important, I think, quite interesting dimension to this that perhaps many people in the context we have here might find quite challenging. Anyone else want to?
So this is why I find it problematic for
Yeah. Okay. Heba, unfortunately, we didn't hear quite a lot of that. Ah, she must be reconnecting. There we go.
I just wanted to jump in and say something briefly about how I think that we can have problems with the way that decolonization is acting, and we can also want to decenter the power that European and culturally Western museums hold. You know, we can have issues with the nationalism that's involved in repatriation and still have the intention of taking the kind of focus and power away from the British Museum and others. And that I don't think these two things are mutually exclusive. I think we can critique these institutions and also have issues with the current standards for restitution and repatriation. The very fact that all of these requests have to go through governments, the fact that it is often made actually impossible for communities to file claims for restitution unless they go through a government or an institution, is part of the ongoing aspects of latent colonialism, as the question suggests. So thinking about restitution, it is important to recognize that in some cases this is the goal. In other cases, what we need to do is recognize the broadness of cultural heritage and the broadness of artistic and material legacies, and try and find other ways of telling stories rather than simply relying on the objects that we have in museums that might be sought for return or not. I would say this as someone who is generally broadly in favor of restitution, but I still have issues with the way that these claims are policed and coerced and controlled, and the natural kind of consequence of the imperialism of museums is that in order to engage with museums, we have to go through imperial power structures.
Yeah. Heba, unfortunately, we lost you for a bit. If your connection is stable now, can you just very briefly summarize your point? Yeah.
Yes, I agree totally with Alice, and we need to remember that most of the current nation states in Africa and the Middle East are the product of colonialism. Like this, the actual design of where the borders lie for each and every country is the fabrication of colonialism. So this is another issue. What I was saying, yes, for the case of Egypt, that the case that went to court when the communities wanted to have a say in where the stone should return, they were denied by the local laws within Egypt itself. And as Alice said, we have no access to any community request. And I'm speaking about Egypt, and I think the broader case in the Middle East, but equally Turkey. This is becoming part of nationalist propaganda that lead to further oppression of the local communities here. Returning, for example, I can imagine returning the Rosetta Stone today to Egypt would lead to us being oppressed for another 30 years. You would think that this is a very simple, small act, but as dictatorships and political propaganda operate, this would be huge, that it gets returned under the rule of a certain head of state, etc., etc. This is very problematic. So this is why I'm saying that it should be the goal, but it should be equally case by case. It shouldn't be that openly return. And we need to also think of how, again, in the case of Egypt, the objects that are put on the wish list of what should be returned to Egypt, these are important objects fabricated by European perception of what is important in ancient Egypt. So it would be the head of Nefertiti, because this confirms with what the West would perceive as the beauty, the standards of beauty. And again, the Western narrative of how we should, the history is only for the kings and queens. And in the very same act, yes, I do admire the bust of Nefertiti, but we do have a similar one here in Egypt as well. Like that we should be, the focus should be in Cairo, in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, rather than giving so much credit to the objects that exist in Western museums, although we have far better masterpieces here that tell far more interesting stories. And we shouldn't buy into the European Western construct of what a culture should and shouldn't be, of what counts as an important object and shouldn't be. Heritage means different things to different people. So far, we are abiding by the Western standards, and this is from an art historical perspective, the typologies, or what counts as a masterpiece, what doesn't count as a masterpiece. And we totally ignore that this is equally personal and emotional. Maybe Nefertiti is important in Berlin for European archaeology, but we have many other wonderful representations of ordinary ancient Egyptian women that would relate so much to the modern Egyptian women today. It would make far more sense for me to highlight these rather than the queen that represents nothing but the majority of ancient population even. So yeah, that's my take.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Heba. Francesco, Chao, do you want to come in on the restitution debate?
Yeah, just to say briefly that I think what happens as well is that we get stuck on the act of return, you know, and return is just such a small process. It's such a small part of restitution in itself, because restitution is a process. It's about rethinking, it's about knowledge, it's about labor, it's about what was lost on this end and what was gained on this other end. And so when I think we have this thing with some work colleagues we've been doing here in Kenya, and we say, what's an us problem and what's a them problem? You know, so an us problem would be, does it go to the right community? Who is, you know, where is the object when it returns? So when Western museums ask, how do we know it's going back to the right person? How do we know it's with the right person at the moment? You know, that's making the assumption that the object is with the right person now. And so we have all these questions in which we're saying that restitution is about so much more than the act of return. And when we get obsessed and stuck in this position, we miss all the nuances of the data, the knowledge, the systems, the pain, the economics of this, of, you know, of what has happened. And I think I just wanted to highlight that in addition to what Alice and Heba have talked about.
It's such a great point that restitution is a process, and I think that process needs to be carefully thought and adapted to the various conditions, political and contexts and conditions in which it is applied. Francesco, did you want to?
Yeah, really to echo what everyone has already said, and perhaps return to the question that I think we have already explored, that when we talk about decolonization or restitution, we're not talking only about objects, we're actually talking about people. And this is vital. This is not object that we're talking about, is memories, collective memories around objects, possibly traumatic memories, of memories that have completely been eroded. They've completely disappeared. I remember going to a workshop organized by Museum Detox, and one presentation was really striking for me, because talking about restitution, they raised the question of, but what do we do when those places are no longer there, when those places are, when those people are no longer there? Because we assume that the world that we inhabit today is the same as 100 years ago, but as we said repeatedly, is being shaped by colonization. So I think shifting the emphasis from objects to people is important, and asking that old question, who is handling this concept of decolonization or restitution? Who is benefiting from it? And when I say benefiting, I really want to push myself to think about something that is quantifiable as well, because we're talking about resources here that have been pillaged, extracted, looted. So return also has some economic implication, not only for the country that receives, you know, the paternalistic gesture of restitution, but as Heba said, for the branding of the museum that does that restitution. So these are all things that there are complexities that we need to take into account. Perhaps one of the things that comes out from restitution, what I'm taking personally, is that it's a blanket term and it shouldn't be used like that.
Okay, it's now 3:15. There are a few more questions that have come in, but unfortunately, I do think we probably need to round up the discussion now. And then perhaps maybe there could be a way that some of those questions could be fed to the panelists after the debate, and then maybe answered online. I'm not sure. But I think maybe just perhaps any final comments. Maybe ask our panelists if there are any final comments or what you've taken away from this really rich discussion that you may wanted to leave with us. Is there any final points that anyone wants to leave with us? Okay.
Well, I'm going to call it the Rashid stone, but also there's a difference between the Rashid stone and the Rosetta stone. So Heba, I'm going to check this. Thank you.
Yeah, we should call it the Rashid stone, because the Rashid takes it to the people. Rashid is the city where there is the people, not the Rosetta, the very peaceful, fine spot that the British Museum sells to us, or European, not just the British Museum, European Egyptology and the West sells to us. So yeah.
Yeah,
thank you.
It's a great suggestion from Alice about maybe extending the conversation and comment on Twitter. So that may be an option for those of you who want to we can do that. So I'd like to just say thank you to all of you, to Alice, to Heba, to Chao, to Francesco, for your really wonderful, layered, provocative, thought-provoking presentations. These are the kinds of conversations that we need to have: uncomfortable conversations, difficult truths, shifting the geography of reason around this question. So thank you all for this. I've learned so much from this, and I really appreciate. And I hope that we can stay in contact. Actually, I really love to stay in contact with all of you and continue this conversation. So, and thanks to Gersimran and the organizers, and Katia, the organizers of this event. Thank you.
Thank you all.
And thanks to the audience for coming. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
So much. Thank you so much, speakers. That was fantastic and so informative. And I'm sure you can see from the chat and from the Q&A, there is so much positive feedback in there. So do have a look. I just want to flag before we leave that the DECR will be back very soon. But in the meantime, do keep an eye out on our website and social media for information about the bursaries to the annual conference. They'll be announced very soon. So do get your applications in. Thank you again, everybody, and thank you to my co-organisers and the association.